I was told this story in the early 1980s by a park ranger. I will repeat it to the best of my recollection. I live in eastern Washington, just about an hour from where the Paul Freeman video was actually made. In the early 80s, I was elk hunting just a few miles from the Mill Creek watershed, and by chance bumped into a ranger along the road whose job it was to patrol the watershed. The watershed is several thousand mountainous acres with heavy timber and very steep ridges. All of it is off limits to the public because it provides drinking water to the city of Walla Walla. We began talking about Paul Freeman, and eventually I asked him if he had ever seen a Bigfoot. He said, "No, but I did have an interesting experience." He told me that one day in the wintertime, he was driving up the mountain alongside the watershed perimeter on the Washington side. Part of the watershed is in Oregon, part Washington. It was snowing, and as he climbed up the mountain, the snow got deeper, and eventually, he was driving through fresh snow with no vehicle tracks in it other than his own. He continued on for some distance before parking the vehicle and deciding to do some walking along the watershed boundary. Apparently, it was here, all alone in a snowstorm, that he ran across fresh Bigfoot tracks down a steep trail and leading into the watershed. No vehicles in the area, no sign of people, no chance of anybody seeing the tracks, and yet there they were. I do not know the name of the ranger, and that I was in my 20s. He looked like 40s, so I'm sure he's long retired. I will also add that he was somewhat skeptical of the whole Bigfoot idea, but he could not give an explanation for the life of him for the tracks. He had absolutely no reason to lie or exaggerate, and even to this day, I 100% believe his story. Not exactly a park ranger story, but it does involve a park ranger. It's the scariest story that I have, and I was camping in northern Michigan with my dad. My grandma lived on a lake and a house near Gaylord, Michigan, which my parents and I would frequent every Friday through Sunday for well over a decade, until my grandmother sold the place. Our routine would be to pack up all necessary equipment for a 3-day camping trip, fit it into our trucks, grab the mountain bikes, and head off to one of the state forests. We then would find a random 2-track leading into the woods. Particularly, we always aimed for those that looked like they haven't been driven on in years due to overgrowth. Find a place to park, offload bikes, and leave. Generally, made our own trail when we could. The goal was to find a stream or river and set up camp in any clearing we could find. Usually, ended up just in a clearing, as we never went more than 10 to 15 miles from the truck. One time, we actually came across an old fountain of what I'm assuming was once an old home. No trail or road remotely near for miles, right on a stream, made of rocks about the size of a brick. There was a small wooden shack, I don't know, maybe 10 or so feet from the foundation, maybe 4 or 4.5 feet tall. I remember my dad had to bend over, and I just hunched. I was a kid, to get inside. Inside were rusted out gun barrels galore, fishing poles, snowshoes, bedding, old pots and pans. Clearly, the area hadn't been used in a very long time. Just cool stuff for a 12-year-old kid. We set up camp about 20 feet away, caught a few bullfrogs and cooked them up for dinner, along with some pan-fried nachos on the small Coleman that we had. You know, with those old-school mini propane tanks. No light pollution. The night sky was amazing. You could see so many stars. To this day, my favorite part about camping is after dark. That night, shortly before we went to bed, we tied up all of our food and hung it up about 15 or so feet in the air, over a branch, like you see in the movies. It keeps bears and other animals out of it essentially. Our normal nightly routine. Shortly after we zipper the tent up to get some sleep, we started hearing grunting and huffing sounds coming from across the creek. Dad, being an avid hunter, says it's likely a deer or elk, maybe a bear, which we have seen all these and more on our trips. Sound does carry pretty far, so Dad wasn't too concerned. We hear it throughout the night, but the sounds began getting almost baby-like. The only way I can describe it is imagine a baby whining softly. Add this with very deep huffs and grunting. Periodically, we would hear a high-pitched, sharp but very short cry. Sounded to me like a baby screaming. Just creepy. Throughout the night, these sounds come and go. Dad loaded the Remington, and I had my little 20-gauge small game ready to go, just in case. My first gun, and my first time taking it with us on one of our trips. We eventually fell asleep. We wake up to nothing too out of the ordinary, except a stench of rotting meat, like a dead animal. We figured an animal had died, and we just could smell it on the wind. We would come across coyote kills sometimes, or some other animals, so we really didn't think anything of it. We go outside to a beautiful sunrise and the sound of flies. Dad just figured we lost the food, and the flies are on it now. Dad walks around back by the food bag and stops abruptly and just says, I still remember it very slowly. What the? Behind our tent are 3 deer, strung up, skinned and gutted. The deer were hung on 3 different branches on the same tree our bag was on, which was untouched. Each head was cut off and set on top of the guts. Each head was pointed directly at our tent. No one around. No footprints. No blood trail. Nothing. Just 3 deer hanging by a vine. No twine or rope. Vines. Dad grabbed the gun and went to try and spot tracks or blood. By the way, he is a phenomenal tracker and has been a guide on a few occasions for experience hunts in the Upper Peninsula. He found nothing. We heard nothing in the night either. Incredibly creepy and disturbing. I was spooked. Dad was spooked too. As we packed up that Saturday and headed back to the truck. No incidents on the way back. Just a normal half-day trip back to the truck. Drove to DNR station and reported it. I just remember the guy looking at me, then my dad, shaking his head slowly and picking up the phone to call whoever. All we heard him say was something like, another skinned animal sighting near the whatever stream. Clearly, it had happened before, but what is going on? Dad never did find out if it was somebody or something. The fact that my dad couldn't find any blood spotting or trails where those deer would have been dragged, or hoof prints where they were perhaps walked. Back in the early 2000s, for a few years, I worked in the forest industry. Much of that time involved me patrolling around my designated area as a park ranger. And although most days were mundane and boring and did not have anything exciting or worthwhile mentioning, there was a stretch of days that still deeply disturbed me. I was in an area where there are no reported bears, wolves, and hardly any cougars or mountain lions, which means that we have an abundance of deer and other wild game. This was in like 2002 or 3, so I don't know if that's changed since. But at the time, there was a lot of deer in the area. Then, one day, as if something radically changed overnight, I found at least 9 different deer corpses in just a short area, all within about a 2.5-mile perimeter of each other. Here's the problem. These weren't just dead deer. They were shredded apart. I'm talking ripped from limb to limb, as if something grabbed them by the two front legs and ripped them down the middle. Sometimes their spines would still be attached. Other times, it looked like something had beat them against a tree, torn their legs off, and grabbed their bodies and squeezed them till their organs popped out, or flat out just grabbed their skin and ripped them open. None of them looked like they died peacefully or pain-free. This went on for a series of about 3 or 4 days, and it deeply disturbed me. The first day, I found the 9. The second day, I found about 2 or 3. And the last day, I found about another 4. All does, no bucks. All having died in gruesome, horrible ways. I saw no evidence or traces of anyone, like a poacher or hunter, coming through the area. And I also saw no traces or tracks of any large mountain lion, cat, or anything. Besides, a hunter or a cougar does not kill this way, nor would they leave the meat or any of the body that way. These deer weren't even eaten on, just brutally killed, gutted, and torn apart, and then left there. All very fresh kills. I worked during the daytime, and it was evident that each day I would find these, the kills had to have been no older than 12 hours old. The other weird thing was, too, flies weren't even buzzing around these corpses. That's very unusual, especially for being at least 12 hours old. They were even hardly decaying. I still wonder to this day what came through and tore up all those deer, and why. If it was a person, what's the point? Why didn't they harvest any of the meat? Why did they degut it and just leave it? And if it was a cougar, why did it kill in such a way that was so destructive? So alien from any way that a cougar normally kills a deer. And of course, why didn't it eat any of the meat? I don't even believe this was a territory kill either. My guess is that all these deer were just suddenly attacked and killed. It doesn't appear as if they ran and hid. It's like they were just attacked and killed on the spot they were standing. I found a couple of them dead by a small stream nearby, as if they were drinking when they were attacked and slaughtered. There also wasn't a lot of blood, while there was a considerable amount of blood in each of the spots where they died, even though their death proved that they were thrown around or torn up. There wasn't a lot of gore or blood really anywhere in like a 6-foot radius from their corpse. It was all very contained, furthering the theory that they were killed and torn apart in that exact small spot. One of the strangest things I've ever seen, as well as creepy and disturbing. This job isn't for everybody. In 2004, I took on a new career, although my career change actually had nothing to do with that series of days that I'm telling you about. It was actually due to moving and wanting to pursue a different path in life.